Good evening. This is Shane Gebauer. I'm the general manager of BrushyMtnBeeFarm. I'd like to thank you all for coming this evening to talk about how to process your beeswax. This talk this evening probably won't take as long as some of the others. I think I'll be able to get through this, but I'll certainly have time at the end for your questions, and I'll try and get through all those as best as I possibly can. If I could, given that I've had some problems in the past when I've done these by myself, just if someone could post in to make sure that they see my screen and can hear me okay, just submit a question just so I know everything's working correctly, and then we'll go ahead and continue on with the presentation. Anyone? Let's see. There we go. Thank you very much, Jeff. All right. We've got a couple others. Thank you very much. Let's talk about how to process your beeswax. This is one of the questions that we get quite often in the fall. Of course, you've harvested your honey. You've got wax. You're not quite sure what to do with it. And there's a couple different options. Some, and I'm sure there's more than what I'm going to present this evening, too. There's lots of different ways to go about this, but there's two ways that I've processed wax in the past, and so we'll get right into that. First off, we need to consider where our wax is coming from. Basically, there's two ways that we can collect wax from our hives. Of course, cappings wax, which is the most obvious, and it's the way that most people get their wax at the end of their honey harvest. But there's also all these scrapings. You can see on the left here a colony that has all this sort of burr comb that's built up here on the top bars, and on the right you can see that that's all scraped off. This is just sort of general housekeeping as you go into your colony and work your colony. If you take a little bit of time each time you go into that colony to clean this up, because it's inevitable, but clean this up. You save this wax. You can process it through either during the season or at the end once your bees are put to bed for winter. And the source of your wax, whether they be cappings or scrapings, sort of dictates a little bit on how you want to go about processing processing that wax, because they may contain things that are a little bit different. In other words, look at this over here on the left. Let me pull up a highlighter here maybe so I can point to things a little bit better. You can see, of course, I've got bees all around the top here, and I'll certainly smoke them and drive them down between the frames, but inevitably I'll end up scooping up some bees. I'll get some propolis and things of that nature. But when you look at cappings, really, the cappings, if we look at this thin sheet here that's been cut from a frame using a cold knife, the cappings basically are pretty clean wax, pieces of wax, with the exception of honey. And so in one case, we've got bees, propolis, maybe little bits of frame with the scrapings, but with the cappings, we've got fairly clean wax, but we've got the honey to deal with. And so there's different considerations then as you take this wax through its process. With cappings, the easiest thing to do is just simply wash off those cappings. Once you're done uncapping, you can take them. You can maybe put them in some water in a pot and sort of float them around, churn them up a little bit, change the water out a couple times. That's one way. You can also put them out away from your colonies in like a shallow baking dish or something like that, and let the bees come and clean them up. But you need to get that honey off of there. And if you wash them, you have to let them dry completely if you're going to use something like a solar wax melter. And the reason for that is that if there's residual water, residual moisture in those cappings, that will end up in your wax as it drips down into the collection pan of a solar melter. Or the other option is you can continue with what I'm calling sort of the water processing, and that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit later on. So the cappings, you need to get rid of that honey, otherwise that will get mixed in with your wax, and then if you wash them, you need to make sure all that water is evaporated off and you've got good dry cappings before you put those into the solar melter, otherwise you'll end up with water in your wax. And I can show you some wax that I processed that's had a little bit of honey still in it, and what that will look like in your block of wax that comes out of your solar melter. So that's cappings. Now scrapings, of course, as I've already mentioned, they're going to have it's going to have a higher level of propolis. You may have some bees or even or cocoons if they're raising drone larvae in that burr comb between the frames. And it's also not that bright white wax that we associate with cappings, but it still makes nice wax. But I mention this because you may want to keep your scrapings separate from your cappings wax, because you will end up with sort of two grades of wax. Now, you can mix them, and in the subsequent slides that I've got here, I do mix scrapings with some cappings and still end up with what I think is some pretty nice looking wax. So you may or may not want to separate it out depending entirely on what you want to do with your wax and just how fussy you want to be with it. Let's talk a little bit about solar melters. These work very well in most areas. If you're living in a valley that doesn't get much sunlight or has a very narrow window just because of where you're situated, it may not be the best. I hear people in the north saying, well, up here in the north it doesn't work very well for us, but it works better in the south. As you know, I lived up north for a while. I had a solar melter up there in upstate New York, and it did work quite well for me. So they do work in northern climates. If you're out in on the West Coast where it rains all the time, up in Washington State, so you've got overcast skies, might not be the best option, but it does work very well. And what basically you do is you just put your wax on the pan here. This is an insulated plastic sheet. Of course, it sort of creates the greenhouse effect. It gets hot in here. If you paint the outside of this black, it helps absorb that heat and get the solar melter a little bit hotter. And as it melts, the wax just drains down and drips into the pan. Now, the first time you use this, because this pan is so smooth, you may sort of get an avalanche effect where wax may sort of slide down in. There is a fold right here that would catch it a little bit, but you may get some chunks going in there. But then as you begin to use it more often, what happens is you do get some propolis that builds up. It sort of gives the wax a little traction so it doesn't landslide down into that. Now, I mentioned honey and water and how that can end up in your wax. What happens is you've got your pan, and this is sort of just a bread pan down here. If you've got water or honey in your wax, and it's melting, you've got this massive wax. It sort of melts from the edges and drains down in, but it doesn't sort of get this nice even flow. It's not very hot where the wax would stay liquid in this pan long enough for the water and the wax to separate. So in other words, you're going to have water and wax running down into this pan, and so you'll end up with little pockets of water interspersed between layers of wax. Because what will happen, and I've got some pictures of this as well, what will happen is you'll get a good melting occurring, and then maybe a cloud goes across the sun, and then the wax will cool a little bit. So you get that layer will sort of solidify in your pan. And you might get a little bubble of water or honey trapped between those layers. And then the sun will come out, a little more will melt, it'll flow down in, and the same thing will occur. Cloud will come, and you'll get these layers, these really nice layers occurring. But it traps the water or honey in those layers. And so then if you go and use that wax for candle making or lip balms or soaps or whatever it is you're going to use it for, you may actually be taking with that wax some of that water, some of that honey, and altering your final product, whatever it is you're making. So you want to be careful of that. You want to make sure that if you're using the cappings wax and you've washed them, that they're good and dry so you don't get water down in here. If you're using the scrapings, almost inevitably you will end up with a little bit of honey down in here, and so your wax will need further processing. But now these solar melters do work very well. Here are a couple bricks that have come out of my solar melter. You can see this one a little darker than this one, but you can see too these sort of black little drops. That's actually drops of honey that have sort of been condensed down. It's good dry honey, probably mixed with a little bit of some byproducts from scrapings or something like that. It may be a little bit of a little caramelized as well because of the heat of that solar melter darkening it up. But you can see that otherwise it's fairly clean wax in both cases. Of course, this one a little darker, this one a little lighter. This could have been off of my honey supers, maybe some of the brace comb or burr comb between honey supers where they're not necessarily raising brood and darkening that wax, whereas over here it could have been wax from in between my brood chambers and giving sort of this darker appearance. So you can see that sort of filtering your wax, or I should say sorting your wax, can really have some benefits in the overall quality that you end up with. But here are some blocks that have come through a solar melter, and you can see sort of the cleanliness of them, with the exception of some honey here. But it does do a very good job of sort of retaining any bees, any propolis up on the that tray that you're placing your bulk wax on, and only allowing the liquid wax to flow down into the bread pan. The other method is what I'm calling water processing. I guess you can call it whatever, a lot of different things, but I'm just, for lack of ease in talking about this process, I'm calling it water processing. The first things you want to consider when water processing your waxes: do not use your best stock pot that you make your favorite stew with, or your favorite chicken noodle soup, or whatever it is you're making, because it ends up looking like this pot here. You can see propolis, you can see wax, no matter how, and you think, oh, it's beeswax, it's edible, it's it's fine. Now you will not be able to restore your pots to a condition that is suitable for cooking. And if your significant other is not involved in your endeavors, they may frown upon your pots coming back to the kitchen looking like this. So what I suggest, invest in an inexpensive set of stock pots. This particular one is from a set of 3 that I picked up at Kmart. I think it was like $24 for a set of 3 stock pots. Each one, a slightly different, smaller pot, so they nest inside, which is good. You can create a water bath situation then. But like $24 for a set of 3, and they even came with some utensils, spoons and such. So invest in a cheap set of stock pots. It's well worth it. Do not use a gas stove. If the wax begins to splatter a little bit and land near those flames or on those flames, it could potentially ignite. So you want to use an electric stove, not the gas stove. What I also suggest is invest in, when you're at Kmart, Walmart, wherever you're going, wherever you choose to get that cheap set of stock pots, also pick up like one of those little tabletop burner type things, and I've got a picture in a second that I can show you what I mean by that. Also, another $20, $40, you get a little 2-burner unit that works very well for wax, soaps, candles, whatever it is you're doing. And then it's dedicated to your beekeeping practice, and you don't end up making a mess. You'll see towards the end of this that it can make a bit of a mess. If you've got cardboard boxes, newspaper, something like that, it's a good idea to sort of spread them around to sort of catch droplets of wax. Don't do this someplace, on your heirloom dining room table, because it will splatter a little bit and make a bit of a mess. I do this out in my garage, where my garage serves also as my my wood shop, so it's already a mess out there. So you want to do that someplace where you can get away with a little bit of splattering. All right. So that's sort of what you're going to need for the water processing. And here's my pot with that little 2-burner unit that I talked about. Now, this one actually, this particular unit was designed for like a buffet type line, and it's in some ways I like it, in some ways I don't. The burners don't get to the point where you can really get stuff into a rolling boil, which is good in some ways, but it also takes a little bit longer because they don't get as hot. It takes a little bit longer to melt the wax. So you sort of have a double-edged sword there, but you can get some that have the old style coils, you know, and those tend to heat a little faster than these with the sealed burners. Of course, the sealed burners are a little bit easier to keep clean, so the mess is less of an issue. But this is sort of what you're looking for a general setup for the water processing steps here. Here are some scrapings that I've accumulated. These actually I found in a box that are a couple years old. You can see that they've definitely got that reddish tint to them. They've got a lot of propolis in here. You can also see, you know, little pieces of bee carcasses that have been scooped up as I'm collecting this wax. So this is far from sort of that clean cappings wax that we saw in the first few slides. This is really going to have a lot of debris in the wax that I'm going to have to deal with. And the way I deal with it is I take my stock pot and I fill it about halfway with water. And this is really important because you'll notice in this image I am not using a double boiler. This pot is directly on the burner. And so I want to make sure I've got water in this pot. You never want to put a pot in direct contact with a burner with only wax in it, because you run the risk of fire. Wax is flammable, so please use caution. By adding the water, I'm taking the wax away from it's not in direct contact with that burner, and therefore is fairly safe. It's not going to combust on me. In fact, I'll get this to a rolling boil, and because of that water, it's a safe environment. If I wanted to just simply melt wax, I would need to put it into a water bath, and that's where that cheap set of stock pots is useful, because this is my largest stock pot here. I could put the water in here, put the wax in the next size down, and sink it down into the water bath, creating that situation where I'm melting the wax without the use of water. But here it is. I've got water. You can see all the bees in there. It's just a real mess that I've got going on in here. And I also threw those blocks of wax that came out of my solar melter, because obviously they had some honey mixed in there, and I don't want that honey in that wax. I want to get it a little bit cleaner so that I can use it for my projects later on. You want to make sure that you don't overfill this. You can see I'm a good probably 2.5, maybe 3 inches from the top of this pot. And the reason for that is I'm going to boil this with the water. And as it boils, it does foam a little bit. And, of course, it spits just like any boiling pot. And so if it's right up to the top, you run the risk of boil over. And that, of course, runs the risk of fire, because if it boils over, it could come in contact. Even though these burners are sealed, even though these burners are electric, it still has the potential to ignite that wax. So you want to make sure you keep it away from the top of the rim of the pot. It's also not a bad idea if you've got one of those little kitchen fire extinguishers to keep it handy. Of all the wax that I've processed over the years, I've never ever seen it combust. I've actually seen it boil to the point where the wax and water has gotten so warm that the water vapor has carried. This was not in my house, fortunately. This was elsewhere. But the water has gotten so, the vapors have carried the wax, the superheated wax, with it to the ceiling, where the water then condensed on the cool surface of the ceiling, and the following day you could see wax all across the ceiling, like little droplets hanging from the ceiling, because they were solidified droplets of wax now. So with the water added, you create a fairly safe environment, but it's still, again, it's a flammable product, so you do want to use some caution. Okay. Here's my pot with the wax now melted. Again, you can see I'm a good, couple inches from the top. You can see all the mess that was part of those scrapings, the wax sort of bubbling away. You can see how it foams a little bit, the bubbles forming here. And this is really right at the beginning of the boiling process. And so if this were right up to the top, there's a very good chance that, as a big bloop comes up to the top of the pot, that some of that could sort of spill over the edge and create problems. You want to make sure you keep it from the top so you don't end up with a big mess on your hands. What I'm going to do with this is now, to try and get a lot of that stuff out, I'm going to pass it through some cheesecloth. Now this is just 2 layers of cheesecloth, so really this is only going to get the really big stuff. If I wanted to filter it a little bit better, I could add additional layers of cheesecloth. Also, what I've used in the past, we sell nylon filter bags for filtering honey, but they also make very, very good filters for filtering liquid wax. And that does a very nice job of collecting a lot of the debris out of the wax. Also, if you've got a lady friend that wears nylons and they're looking to get rid of some old pair, as long as they don't have runs in them, you can use those nylons to filter your wax as well. What I've done here is just sort of stretch this across the top, and you can't really see, but I've got you can see a little piece of string right here, I guess. I've got butcher string just wrapped around the rim here. And with the lip of the pot, it forms a nice, secure way of holding this cheesecloth in place so that when I go and dump the pot of liquid wax through here, it doesn't fall in on me. And again, this is part of that same inexpensive stock pot set. This is just my next size down. This is the medium-sized pot. And this is another reason why in this picture right here, I don't want my pot too full, because I'm going to pour it in to a smaller pot, and I don't want to overflow it. I want to make sure I can fit my entire contents of my big pot into this one right here. Again, now depending on how clean you want your wax would depend on what you're using here for filter. Given that I've got a big mess up here, a lot of propolis, a lot of bees, I'm just looking for a coarse filter at this point, because if I go too fine, I run the risk of it taking too long to drain through, and while it's waiting to sort of drain through, because the very fine pores of my filter material get plugged, if it takes too long to drain through, it may actually solidify on that filter, and that can create some problems too. So I'm just going for a coarse filter at this point to get the bulk of that stuff out of my wax. And here it is, and now I'm in my garage. You can see little droplets from previous pours, sort of on my concrete floor here in my garage. Some mess that's occurred from previous pours. So you can see you don't necessarily want to be doing this in your kitchen on your dining room table. You may actually want to go outside for this step. I wouldn't necessarily suggest doing this outside, because if it's a nice warm day, the bees will be attracted to the smell of this wax being processed, and they will come in and investigate, and so you may end up with a lot of bees flying around if it's a really nice day, and that just makes it a little more difficult. But certainly if you want to just take these 2 pots outside, set them on your driveway in the grass or something like that, just for this step, that wouldn't be a bad idea at all. But here you can see I'm pouring it through my cheesecloth. You can see the string right here holding it secure. Rubber bands work okay, but sometimes that first initial dump of the wax and the first sort of plunk of the propolis and bees and things like that may actually sort of hit that filtering material with a little bit of force, and rubber bands sometimes can slip. Whereas the string will not and holds it fairly secure. So string's a little bit better than rubber bands. Okay, so I'm pouring from one to the next, and then what I'll do is I'll pull this cheesecloth up. You can see again the nice bits of red propolis in there, as well as all the bees and other pieces of debris that were in there. And now you can see I'm a little bit closer to the top of my pot, but I'm going to bring this back to a boil again, which we've got going on here. And then once I'm done with that, once I've gotten this back to a rolling boil, I'm just simply going to turn it off. I'm going to leave it right on the burner, but I'm going to turn it off. I always make sure I unplug that little burner too, to make sure that there's no chance of the thermostat being stuck or anything like that. It's off, it's unplugged, it's safe. And I'm going to leave this overnight. Do not take this pot and throw it in your freezer to try and cool it faster. You want this to cool as slowly as possible, but do not put a lid on it, because this has been boiling. You've got water vapor, you've got steam coming off. If you trap that moisture with a lid, what'll happen is it'll prevent the water and wax from getting a good clean separation, because you'll get water collecting on your lid, dripping back down onto the top of the wax, which will float. So you'll have water on the top of, on the underside of the lid, which is essentially above the wax layer. And then, of course, as the water cools and separates out in the pot, you'll end up with a water layer below. But as the droplets fall from the lid, it'll have to pass through that that wax layer, and you get the opportunity for mixing at that point. So don't put a lid or a cover or anything on top of this, but you do want it to cool nice and slowly. If you can do it in a warmer environment as opposed to in a cold garage, if your garage is unheated and it's 30 degrees out in there, the wax will cool more quickly, and you won't get as clean a separation or dividing of the water and the wax. The slower this cools, the better separation and the cleaner your wax will be. So just leave it overnight and let that plug solidify. And here we go. This is what I've got. But you can see, again, I used a very coarse filter cloth, so you can still see bits of debris, little flakes of debris. Over here's a little bit bigger chunk in this wax. If I want to get this a little cleaner, which I do, unless I'm dunking pine cones in this wax to make fire starters, in which case you'd never see these little flakes, which make great fire starters, by the way. Excellent gifts around the holiday times. Just take some pine cones and dunk it in liquid wax. It could be your dark wax. They work nice. But if I want to get this cleaner for candle making, for soap making, lip balms, etc., I need to get this wax cleaner. So what I will do again is take this plug of wax, I'll pop it out of the pot. This is the underside of it. You can see I've scraped this half, for the most part, fairly clean. I'll probably do a little more cleaning around my edge. But you can see it's a fairly thin layer of this debris that floated on the water but sank in the wax. So what I'll do is scrape this clean. That gets just about all of the debris off the bottom of this and gets almost pure wax above. If I've got a lot of chunks, I may do the water process again, and this time use a finer filter. Instead of that cheesecloth, I'll go with that nylon strainer bag, in which case this plug will end up just as clean as can be. Or I might want to go with just a water bath and just melt the wax in a pot and then pour it through that nylon filter cloth at that point. Because my pots are fairly dirty, if I do the water process again, it actually may pick up some debris from my pots. So I might want to put it into a cleaner pot and do a double boiler and get some of this debris out of there. But that this image right here, once this has gone through a second filter, you will end up with very clean wax here. And if you've gotten good separation, if it's cooled slowly, you will have wax essentially that you can use for candle making or for soaps or for lip balms. And that's really it. I mean, there's really not too much more to it. And that's all I've got for this evening. It's one of my shortest webinars ever, and so I'm going to turn to my questions here. Let me just give me 1 second here while I get my controls back so I can look at the questions. Which let me just get through. Unfortunately, when I'm doing these by myself, I can't do some screening. How do you dry wax after you wash it? You can just put it out in the sun in one of those shallow baking dishes. You can just sort of spread it out and leave it in a nice warm area inside. You don't want to take that wad of cappings wax that you've washed and just sort of leave it in a wad, because what may happen is you may have a little bit of honey left over, which provides essentially nutrients for things like mold, yeast that could begin to ferment, and that will affect the quality of your wax as well. And so you want to make sure that it can dry fairly easily without sort of beginning to get those fermentation or molds growing. So you want to be able to spread it out so that it dries out fairly quickly. We've got why should cappings be removed? Place some distance from hives for cleaning. I usually put mine right on my hive top. The reason why you want to sort of take them away from your colony is, generally speaking, when you're doing your harvest, most people, I should say, are doing their harvest in August, September, and that may be when you're processing your cappings. And at that time, there could be a little bit of a nectar dearth, and so by putting them right on top of a hive, you'll be bringing bees in from the surrounding area. Not necessarily bees from your hive. And so you could create a robbing situation. By taking your cappings and placing them, several hundred feet from your colony, it brings all those bees that are coming in to rob out your cappings are not right at the doorstep of your colony. And so you're less likely to develop a robbing situation. How can you separate wax and honey from scrapings when the wax is being crushed to get most of the honey out? So this, if you're crushing your comb as a form of extracting your honey, what I would suggest is doing the water processing method, and that way the honey will get dissolved in the water. And not using a solar melter right away, because you'll end up with a lot of honey in that wax. So use the water process method. That will get a good portion of the honey out of that, and then you can take that chunk of wax that you see right here on my screen and continue to process it further. If you're just taking scrapings and you've got a little bit of honey in there, you can put it in a solar melter. It'll probably end up in your wax, and you'll still need to do some further processing, or you can just go right with the water process. Most of what I do is I put it right into the water, just because it gets rid of all the honey that may be in there, or if it's cappings, it'll deal with any water that may still exist in the cappings. Can you lighten dark wax? You can, actually. There's lots of ways that you can do it, some which you may like, some which you may not. I've heard of people adding, this one I don't know about, but I've heard people adding lemon juice to it actually will sort of bleach it out a little bit. You might end up with sort of some lemon-scented wax, but I suspect if you're boiling, and a lot of the volatiles of that lemon scent would be boiled off. Peroxide, hydrogen peroxide bleaches it out. Actually, you can add a little bit of chlorine, a little bit of bleach to it. Now, I'm not necessarily advocating these. These are just options. But what a lot of people do on a small scale, which I suspect most of the folks listening in here tonight are on sort of a small scale, if it's bits of wax, you can take that, like those scrapings, and you can leave them out in the sun. And the sun will actually bleach it out and lighten it up a bit. And so you can do that as well. Can you use hot water in an old crock pot turned on high? If you're using this as a as sort of a, you can certainly do that with a double boiler if it gets hot enough. If that crock pot will get hot enough to melt the wax, which it should, if you're using it as a double boiler. If you want to add the wax to the water inside the crock pot, you can do that as well. Most crock pots will boil water, so it probably will. You'll just have to get the wax out of there. Some crock pots have the removable innards that would make that easier. Some don't. I've got a very old one that doesn't, and so it would be sort of inconvenient for me to use my crock pot. You can pick up those stock pot sets pretty inexpensively and probably worth it, because you can also then do your candle and soaps and things like that with that set. I use my smallest one, and I keep that clean for melting my wax for candles. What about using a stainless steel double strainer? That certainly that probably maybe is a little bit finer. The bottom portion of that's a little bit finer than some of that cheesecloth I had in there, so you'll still end up with some particulates in there, but it'll get most of it. That wouldn't be a bad idea, of course, because the coarse portion of that would catch a lot of the larger debris, allowing the smaller stuff to go through, and then the finer one catching the smaller, so less likely to sort of plug itself up before it actually had a chance to drain out. So that wouldn't be a bad idea. But it's still, it would probably have to be dedicated for your wax processing, because trying to get all that debris off your stainless steel double strainer after you're done pouring your wax through would be a challenge. And heat metal and it will prevent rust for you. Heat metal and it will prevent rust for a year. I assume this is if you heat metal and apply beeswax to it. Is that right, Barry? That it will inhibit rusting, so that's a good use of beeswax. A lot of blacksmiths do that. Let's see. Do you recommend using a crock pot for remelting clean wax for candle making? Yes, a lot of people do that. Here's the problem with crock pots, though, is you've got to get your wax out of it somehow. You can't really pour into a candle mold from a crock pot, and so you can use it as a double boiler, or if you've got someone handy. I know people that have actually drilled holes in the stock pot and fitted spigots so that you can pour the melted wax from your crock pot through the spigot into a pouring pot. But you'll need to, if you're doing candle making, we'll talk a little bit about this in a future webinar, you need to be able to get the wax out of that pot into something smaller that's a little bit more convenient for pouring. And that's the only drawback to using crock pots is that issue right there. What tool do you use for scraping the plug after you popped it out of the pan? So what tool, that's the picture right here that I've got up. What tool did I use for scraping the bottom of that? A hive tool, of course. What else would a beekeeper use? Does it matter if it's metal or plastic? You'll want to use a metal one, because to really scrape this, you've got to sort of bear down on it. And what I do, too, is I scrape it over top of the pot that I used for my my boiling. So that way all the scrapings that come off of this, any wax that comes off of this, goes into that pot and I reprocess it. Of course, I'm reprocessing all my junk too, but that's sort of something that I'll have to deal with on a later date. Pine cone fire starters. Do you use a wick as well? Can you add additional fragrance? Sure, actually, This is getting a little too personal here, but one year my wife and I, we strapped for cash, homemade gifts, beautiful idea. So here's some homemade gifts idea for those of us on the cheap. Take some pine cones. You can take your darkest wax out there, melt it, dip it into that wax. You might have to dip it several times to get the wax to accumulate on the pine cone. And if you've used that stuff called fat wood, it works the same way. You can just almost throw it in the fire, light it with a match, maybe put a little piece of paper underneath it to get it going. Or put it on top of a couple pieces of kindling so as the wax melts, it drips down onto the kindling with additional kindling on top of the pine cone. Works great. The other thing that works well too, Lisa, is the cardboard egg cartons. Pack it with dryer lint, only from if you're using natural fiber though, no synthetic fiber. Pack it with dryer lint and pour wax into the cardboard wells packed with dryer lint or wood shavings. You can break off one of the little wells, throw it into your fireplace or wood stove. They work wonderful too. So that's fire starters and homemade gifts on the cheap, but they work well. How can you prevent cracking when using beeswax with metal molds? The cracking occurs, and we'll talk a little bit about this when I talk about candles. The cracking occurs when the wax cools either too quickly, generally because it cools too quickly. What I try and do is when I'm pouring it into molds and I want to prevent the cracking, you want to again make sure it cools slowly, but I also don't get my wax too terribly hot either, because then it has to cool that much more before it actually turns to a solid, and so you've got that greater chance of cracking then as well. I hope that made sense. But you want to control the speed at which it cools to prevent that cracking. Will the solar melter sort of help bleach or whiten the wax? Yes, it will to some extent, but generally not too much, and the reason being that the wax usually melts and falls down into that pan fairly quickly, and therefore you only have the upper layer of wax that's really being exposed to the light. And generally speaking, too, you've got additional liquid wax falling on top of that. So there really isn't sufficient time for the sun to work its magic, so to speak, to bleach out that wax before it solidifies inside the pan, the collection pan. How much wax do you get? It depends entirely on how you uncap your frames in terms of uncapping. It depends on how fastidious you are in cleaning your colony when you work it and scraping things down. I've gotten off of 10 colonies about 10 pounds worth of wax using a cold knife and collecting all my scrapings over the course of a season. But again, if you're using something like our sideliner or uncapper, which I suspect most of you aren't, you don't get much wax from that. If you don't scrape your top bars clean every time, you won't get that scraping. So it's sort of hard to say, Ethan, how much wax you're going to get. Let's see here. Have you tried using a colander for straining? Yeah, you can use anything anything to filter that wax. Again, it all depends on how much debris you want to get out. A colander has fairly large holes, and so you're going to end up with a lot of debris falling through that. Plus, that colander, you're not going to want to use that for straining your spaghetti for dinner once you're done filtering your wax. Already talked about that. How do you store the processed wax? This is a really good question, and I'm not sure, Lisa, if it was you. I can't recall it, honestly. I'm embarrassed to say, but someone emailed me just today or yesterday saying, you know, as I'm storing my wax, it seems to be getting a little bit darker, and they were storing it in metal pans. Well, if you store wax in metal, ferrous metal, iron metal that's not stainless, it can actually react a little bit with the metal and sort of darken. And that's particularly true with that collection pan. If you're using a metal pan as opposed to an aluminum pan or a galvanized pan, and the wax sits in contact with those pans for an extended period of time, it can alter the color of your wax. So what I suggest is, once you've got it either in this plug form here, or once you've got it in a bread pan from that solar melter or whatever you're using, once it's hardened, pop it out. I just put mine in a plastic grocery bag and put it in a box and store it that way until I need it. But you can pop it out of those molds, so to speak, and store it like that, because you don't need to keep it in that mold to keep the wax together. It's a nice solid plug at that point, and can be stored just like that. If you don't have a sunny day, wait until tomorrow, or wait until you've got an extended period of sun. The solar melter that I've gotten, as well as the one that we've got in our catalog, and most solar melters on the market have some way of sort of draining off water if it happens to rain, so it doesn't get down into the melter itself. In fact, I've got mine, of course, now that the sun is getting lower in the sky, I'm not getting very good melting right now, even in the south, but I've got mine sitting outside of my driveway right now processing the last little bit of wax that I collected here over the past month or so. And it's just sitting out there. Kind of, I get a good warm day, good warm sunny day, it melts a little bit, and then probably goes a couple days with no melting. So I've just left it out there. What happens if you don't wash the cappings or scrapings before melting them? If you don't wash your cappings and you melt them in a solar melter, you're going to get all that honey, no matter what method of uncapping you're using. You're going to get honey in your cappings, and that honey is going to end up in your wax. Now, if you're boiling them, like I showed you here towards the tail end of the presentation, you don't necessarily have to wash them, because that boiling is only going to introduce water, but when it cools, as I talked about, you'll separate the water and the wax. So you don't have to wash them if you're going to boil, but if you're using the solar melter, you definitely want to wash them up so all that honey doesn't end up in your wax, because that gets a little messy. Can you use both propolis and burr comb for making wax, or do you toss the propolis? If I'm getting clean propolis, I try and keep that aside. There's little places in your hive that bees will put propolis. Like right around the rim of the inner cover, where it sits on top of the colony. They usually put a little bead of propolis there. I'm not going to throw that into my bucket. I'll keep that separate. I actually have little jars. As I mentioned, I have a wood shop, so I'm collecting that. I've got dreams of using all that propolis to make a nice finish and make a nice piece of furniture with a propolis varnish someday. So I'm just saving all that. I'm not going to mix that in with my wax, but inevitably all those scrapings that I showed you and was obvious in the pictures, they had a lot of propolis mixed in there. I'm not going to take that stuff that I filtered out and try and separate out the propolis from all the other junk that's in there. I'm just going to leave that be. So you can sort of separate it out the best you can, but if you're boiling it, I'm not too worried about a little propolis getting in with the wax from my scrapings. Let's see here. So this person, Alan, has said that he's read online that you don't want to boil your beeswax, that it messes up the structure of the wax. Is there anything to this? I have not heard this. If anyone else has, please let me know. I'm always interested to hear about that. And I know we've got some people online here that are experienced beekeepers and may have encountered that information. I know the boiling is a fairly common method, not only in smaller operations, but also in very large operations in terms of how to process wax. Honestly, Alan, I haven't heard anything, but I know a lot of places are doing it. That's not to say that they can't do it better. If you're concerned about that and don't want to boil, you can do a double boiler where you don't actually bring your beeswax to a rolling boil, and you can pass it through the filter. Then the issue with that is that you might not be able to get the wax as hot, and therefore you may not be able to filter it quite as easily, because it'll start to solidify on whatever it is you're filtering, using the filter rather. Is there, let's see, already talked about lightening up wax. Does this, so this person's wondering if they can recycle their old brood frame by using sort of this process of boiling. Sure you can. I wouldn't necessarily suggest taking that old brood comb and converting it back into foundation. You might want to use it for more craft type things like those fire starters, because it's going to be sort of a darker wax, and you also have the risk of some disease being in that old brood wax as well, and that may create problems if you use that for foundation by either running it through a mill, applying it to wax, whatever the case may be. How do I keep the cappings and scrapings until I'm ready to clean and melt it in a jar in the freezer? The cappings usually, I sort of incorporate the processing of my cappings wax into the process of sort of my honey harvest at the end of the season. I don't like those to linger on too much, because you do run the risk of things sort of happening to them, if you will. There's going to be honey in those cappings. The honey may begin to absorb some moisture out of the air. If it's stored in a damp place, you may begin to get some fermentation. If you wash them but don't get them completely dry, you may begin to get some molding or fermentation going on. So I do like to process my cappings wax as soon as I've collected those cappings. The scrapings, I'm not getting as much in the way of honey in there. Usually there's not much honey inside those the scrapings. So those I might store in a bucket. I actually, that bucket that I was using was an old bucket that Mitaway 2 came in. I carry that to the bee yard with me, and every time I just scrape my colony down, I throw my scrapings rather, into that bucket. And then once I get a sizable amount, I'll just throw it in my solar melter. And the solar melter, while it might not get all the honey and it might not get all the debris out 100%, it gets it to the point where I can throw that block aside and maybe process it later on at my leisure. And generally speaking, I've got 14 colonies at the house, and generally speaking, after I go through them and work them, I'll have, you know, a ball of wax that I've collected from the top bars and working and scraping the inner cover, etc. And so like I said, I just keep my solar melter outside, and I'll just crack the lid and throw it inside and let it melt down. But if you need to, you can put it in a freezer. That will prevent wax moth if there's enough resources for them to create a mess in there. It'll also prevent some fermentation, but it depends on your freezer space. Is comb that has a mold totally unsuitable for process? I'm gonna err on the side of caution here and say yes, because I don't know really just how moldy it is and how much funk it's really got. So I might say yes to that. But you could certainly keep it separate, throw it into your solar melter, try it in a little pot, boil it up, see what you get. But I would be cautious of that. Let's see here. Does honey and wax give it a certain fragrance? The wax, beeswax, good clean beeswax that hasn't been pressure filtered and ultra refined, really has a very nice fragrance to it all on its own. The honey, what'll happen there is it's like water and oil, which essentially wax is a lipid. It separates out in water, and so you get separation of the honey and the wax. And so it's not really a homogeneous mixture that will add fragrance, but rather what will happen is you'll end up with little sort of little blisters inside the chunk of wax that contains honey. Let's see. How hard is the debris that I scraped off the bottom of this plug? I just took the edge of my hive tool and scraped it off. Tammy's wondering about a butter knife. You could probably use a butter knife. It'll get wax on it and some other debris, so you don't want to use your best sterling silver. Use an older one, but you can certainly use that. But really, a hive tool works quite well. How clean should the wax be if you're using it for lip balm? I'll show you some clean wax when we talk about candle making. But let me just let's see here. Let me go. Oops. Let's see if I can go back up to the very beginning here. Probably be easier if I just exit out of this. The wax up here at the very start is good clean wax. You can see here, Sandy, that there's really no debris here. This is good clean wax that you could use for lip balm, soaps, etc. So you don't want to see any debris. Let's see. Even if you're using a solar melter, it seems like you need to do the water processing anyway. Not necessarily. It depends. I mean, if you're throwing scrapings in that solar melter, probably yes, because you're going to end up with some debris in those chunks of wax that are in that bread pan. If you're only processing cappings and you've washed them thoroughly, you've let them dry, if the bees have robbed them out, inevitably you'll have some bee parts in those cappings then. So then you may want to put them into the water process method. But if you've just washed them, air dried them thoroughly, and put them into a solar melter, you'll end up with some pretty clean wax. If you're entering in a show for judging, how many times do you expect to process to make it show quality clean? Show you only capping. If you're entering into a show, I would not throw any of the scrapings into your wax. They're going to inevitably darken that wax up a little bit. If you're entering it into a show, admittedly, I've never entered in any of my wax into a show. Each one I know has slightly different specs. Let me think about this here. If you're entering into a show, there's no certain set number in terms of how many times you're going to have to process this through some sort of filter. If you're entering into a show, the finer the filter you can use, the better off you'll be. In other words, the more stuff you'll get out, and the purer that wax will look. Now, my sort of hesitation at the onset here was the mold, and I was thinking of the mold that you might use to sort of cast the wax that would put it in a format that would appeal to the judges, and that's where the individual show may set some standards on what you want to consider there when you're casting your wax in mold form. But the finer the filter, the better off you'll be to get the wax clean. So there's no set number of times. It has more to do with what you're using for filter cloth. This wax right here has come from our processing, which goes through numerous filters. The finest is 100 micron, and so it gets a lot of material out. If you're using filter cloth, you're going to probably want to maybe double layer that filter cloth even. If you can go to, this is getting really carried away, but you can almost go to a fabric store and pick up some high quality material that's got, like a higher thread count, because the thread count dictates how many threads per inch. The higher the thread count, the more threads per inch. That means the smaller the pores, essentially, the spacing between the threads going to be, and the better filtering you'll get. So you may want to go to a fabric store and pick up something like a 400 thread count, and that's going to get some really good filtering qualities to it, and you end up with some very, very nice wax at the end. Can you filter wax as it drips from your solar melter into that bread pan? It depends a little bit on just how hot and just how good of a melting day you're having. If you've got a marginal day, what will happen is it'll hit that filter and actually cool almost instantaneously and not melt through and filter. If you're got a really scorcher of a day, Mark, if you're in the desert Southwest and you're hitting temperatures of 110 and just the sun is baking, absolutely. But if you're getting temperatures only into the 70s and you're getting patchy clouds passing before the sun, you're not going to have a very good melting day, and you're going to get it collecting. You're going to get it collecting on top of that that filter, and not really get a good filter as a result. Does Brushy use a layer bleed valve on liquid wax to separate pure wax? Carl, I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. I can tell you what we do. I don't think it's what you're describing here. We essentially have a modified milk tank that serves. We put some water in there, so we create that water situation. We don't bring it to a rolling boil, but what we do is take hot water that passes through our furnace that's fired by our wood scrap, and we blow that or stream that hot water onto the jacket of our tank, and that essentially then melts that wax, and we get the same sort of separation that we got here in my slideshow. That wax then is using a modified oil pump, which is designed for hot oils. We use a modified oil pump to pass it through a series of filters, one of which is a stainless steel mesh, that 1,000 micron mesh filter that's an inline filter. And it goes through that. Now, before it goes through that, it goes through a couple of coarser filters to get out the particulate. But I'm not sure if that's. I don't believe that's what you're looking for here. That layer bleed valve. I'm not sure what that is. But that's essentially how we process the wax here at the bee farm that we sell. Does heating the wax to a boil darken the wax? Does it have to boil to pass through the cheesecloth? No, it doesn't have to boil. You can stop it beforehand. Now, if you do repeated or prolonged boils, it does begin to affect the appearance of the wax. And maybe, Alan, this gets to your point a little bit, that it does eventually alter the characters of the wax a little bit. But that's after repeated boils or prolonged boiling that you begin to see those the effects of that affecting the appearance of the wax. So you can stop short of a boil, just melt it. But with that boiling, you get better separation of the layers, and you get as the water sort of settles out through that wax, because you sort of create a homogeneous mixture by the boiling. As the water and wax separate, the water sort of pulls down with it a lot of the debris. The other thing that you'll note, which I didn't show, but when I dump the water out of the pot, there's also a lot of debris in that water as well that's sort of been pulled from the wax as they've separated. Let's see here. Let's see. I'm just going through some of these questions I've already addressed. Using a so here's someone that's using a crock pot and using a stainless steel measuring cup to dip the wax out. I assume out of a crock pot to pour into a metal mold. So that's what they're using. Will dark wax take coloring additives? I assume this is you're trying to color your wax for candle makings. Maybe holidays are coming up. Maybe you want green candles. Maybe you want red candles. The problem with using beeswax without putting it through a fairly intensive processing method, you end up with this sort of orangey yellow natural colored beeswax. And so you've got to take that natural color into mind as you're trying to change, to create blues, to create reds and greens, that you're not starting from a white. And so coloring beeswax with coloring, candle colorings, is this natural beeswax anyway, is rather difficult. Now, if you've got, if you want to make green, yellow and blue make green, so you can add some blue and come up with some shades of green, but you're never, it'll be very, very difficult to get that sort of holiday green, that holiday red that you may be seeking this time of year. And so you're better off in that case starting with a white beeswax if you want to use beeswax or paraffin. Can I use wax that had wax moth in it and melt it? Yes. All the debris from the wax moth damage will be removed in the processing. Can the propolis be reclaimed from the garbage you strained off with the coarse filter? You can. You can dissolve that propolis and create sort of a tincture, if you will. But then you've got it dissolved in that solvent, and so you don't necessarily have a solid that you've reclaimed. Let's see here. What do you think about the cappings? Oh, Ethan, I'm going to read this aloud. You're going to make me read this aloud. What do you think of the Cappings melter manufactured by Walter T. Kelly Company? How do you use it? Honestly, I'm not familiar with their Cappings melter enough to really comment. I haven't used it, so I can't comment on how it works, its ease, how well it processes the wax. I have used jacketed tanks from Maxant that process cappings, and those work very well because you've got they've got two valves on their tank, one which is lower than the other. And so what you can do there is put your water in, put your wax in, heat it up, let it separate out. But before the wax cools, but the water settles to the bottom, but before that wax actually solidifies, what you do then is you open up that bottom valve, let it drain out into a bucket, and what you're doing is draining off the water until you start to see wax coming out. Then what you do is you pour off the wax from the upper valve, and now you're getting good clean, and that's also typically above that layer. Let me jump down to the, let me get out of my slideshow here. This layer right here, the upper valve is typically above this nasty layer, and so you get fairly clean wax coming out of their melters. But the Kelly one, I'm not familiar enough with it. Let's see here. Have I ever used a paper towel for a filter? I haven't used paper towels. I've tried coffee filters, but they're sort of hard to hold unless you've got something that's really designed to hold a coffee filter. So you can think about it like the basket that a coffee filter fits into, but they only have that tiny little hole that lets the coffee drain through. So it drains fairly slowly. So not really the ideal filtering method. Let's see here. Let's see. How long do you boil the wax in water? Will it get cleaner the longer you boil it? No, it won't necessarily get cleaner. I only bring it to a boil, and the reason for that again is that you sort of get that homogenizing of the wax and water, so that when they cool, then the water settles out through that wax and brings with it a lot of the junk that may be in the wax. Any other electric cappings melters out there? Actually, we're going to be introducing, or I should say we're looking at introducing an electric melter into our catalog for 2010. So there's that one. I know there's others out there, but some of them are really large scale and expensive. So probably the best thing, Ethan, is take up a conversation a little later on. So this person's put cappings in a bag in the freezer. That's just fine. Save them that way until you're ready to process them. Are there any scents that can be added to beeswax? Sure. There's all sorts of scents depending on what you're looking to do with the wax. Essential oils, fragrance oils, all different things that you can add to your beeswax. Again, if you're dealing with the wax that we're dealing with here in the talk, you've got that natural odor of beeswax that you're going to have to overpower. If you're going to add oils, essential oils or fragrance oils to your wax, you want to do it as close to the melting point of the wax as possible. Because if I were to throw in an essential oil while that mixture was boiling, the volatiles would essentially evaporate right out. The scents would evaporate right out of the mixture, and so I can dump a lot in but not have very strong odor. So you want to add it close to the melting point so you don't drive off a lot of those aromatics by boiling or overheating it. Is there a easy way to remove wax from dishes? So I assume maybe these are like little splatters, small thin layers of wax that we're talking about here. There is a wax remover that you can use. You can scrape it off. If you're talking about getting the wax off the pots that I was showing, you can use some of that wax remover. What I do is sort of actually in this image here, you'll notice some streak marks. Where did it go? Where did it go? Where did it go? In this image here, you'll notice some streak marks in there because shortly after I pour the water wax mixture out of this pot, I just take a paper towel and sort of wipe it to try and clean it. I could then take a wax remover and try and clean it further if necessary. Are the notes available for the presentation? All webinars are posted to our library. Usually it'll probably be there by the time most people are at work tomorrow morning in our video library. I've heard of pressing wax in a hand press. So is this to sort of filter it? I'm not quite sure what you're trying to do with it. If it's a solid, you'll press out the honey, but you're still going to have, you could still have debris in that wax, and you'll still have honey in that wax. What's the purpose of using that hand press? I suspect it's to sort of press, to literally press any honey out of it. A lot of people don't use extractors to get their honey from their frames. They literally cut the comb from the frame and then press it to extract the honey that way. Usually when this person's asking about how much honey may be left in the wax after the water processing method, usually there's not. The honey is usually left from when I use a solar melter, and not necessarily from the water. The water dissolves that honey and brings it into solution and deals with it that way. Is honey bad for your wax? No, it'll just create these little pockets of liquid, and if you're trying to use it for candle making, you'll get an inferior candle. What'll happen is if you've got little tiny bubbles of water or something like that in a candle, it'll sort of cause the candle to sort of spark a little bit and create some problems with the burning of the candle. So you want to try and get all that out of it. Let's see here. Can they use old foundation? You can throw, and now I assume this is foundation that you haven't used, or is it? If either way, you can melt it down. You may want to keep it separate from some of your good cappings, depending on what you want to do with your wax. Let's see here. All right. That gets through just about all the questions, and like I said, this is one of the shorter webinars that I've had. Let's see. Oh, just had a latecomer here. I just want to let's see. Oh, just thank you. Okay. Sorry about that. I'd like to thank you all for coming. I hope this was helpful. Again, all webinars are recorded and posted up to our video library after the fact, usually about 24 hours after the fact. So if you'd like to refer back to this, you certainly can up there. Again, thanks for coming, and look forward to seeing you in future webinars. Have a good evening.